start.
Okay, that's fine.
And then I'll introduce the session and then we can just start the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you work with Ruth?
Yes. I work with Ruth on the My Science journey. Yeah. I'm part of
Wow.
yeah. Great.
Right.
I think we are on. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we're back with another webinar on My Science Journey, where we bring scientists to share their science journeys so that we can learn from them and learn from each other. And I'm very excited about today. Today's guest is someone who's helping to shape the future of science in Africa in line with our quarterly theme. And he doesn't just do this in theory, but he does this through action, innovation, and powerful collaborations across the continent, which you will hear about. And he bridges the gap between biomedical research and big data. So I'm sure our data enthusiasts in the audience are curious to hear how this happens. And his science journey has spanned 3 continents, as we will hear from him, and many milestones, but with one mission, which is to unlock the capacity potential of Africa. And without further ado, I think if I start speaking, I'll say so much, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Daudi Djingo from Uganda. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we are very excited to learn from you.
Mhm.
And I think before we get into the science, the science journey itself, I'd like to just get the conversation going by asking if there's a book or a quote or a song that has stuck with you all through your science journey. Yes.
Yeah, and thank you, Anita, for that very nice introduction and for getting me with such, I think one book actually that for me was sort of helped to tickle my inquisitiveness or to tickle my interest in science, especially genomic science. I would say actually 2 books. The first one was, of course, by Watson and Crick. After they discovered, or after they figured out the DNA code. It's a very interesting book to see the sort of the thought process and the interest and the dedication and the energy, but also the excitement that can accompany science. So that is one book. The other one actually is a much older book by Charles Darwin, when he was just sort of figuring out um, the evolution of species. I forget the actual title. I think it's called either The Evolution of Species or I forget what the actual title is. But it was a book that was very interesting. It was almost like you were watching a movie, just listening to the reasoning and the interest that led to the realizations of things which we take for granted today, but which there was a time when nobody knew about them, or when as science or as humans, we totally thought different about how life works. Uh, so that was also another interesting book from the 19th century.
Yeah. You mentioned Charles Darwin. My mind just went back to my history lessons, and we were learning about the different evolution of the human life. But
Right.
so just take us back to almost the beginning, not the very beginning, but like when you decided you want to pursue a career in science, if that was driven by anything, was it role model, a movie, a book? So what sparked your interest in science?
So it's funny because uh, the science journey is something where you realize after some time that it's not even like one decision that happens at a certain time, but at some level, it's a series of decisions that accumulate over time. And the reason I say that is that at least in the way that our education system is structured, at least here in Uganda,
Mhm.
the first decision of consequence that one makes, at least for most people, is at around age 16 or 17, when you have to choose which combinations of subjects to do.
Yeah.
Which is sort of interesting because I think at 16 and 17, really somebody barely knows what they want to do, or even some kids would know what they want to do, but I think most would not have had enough exposure to make a truly informed decision. Um, but luckily, I think it's changing a bit now because people can, even when you make a wrong choice at that stage, I think it's possible to correct course later on. But I think for me, actually, the reason was less about science and more about interest, because I think science subjects, I used to find them more tractable. You know, if it's math, you could actually compute something and get the answer. If it's physics, you could do the same. Biology was on the border because it's both uh, it has a level of finiteness, but it's also in some ways an infinite science because you don't necessarily compute things, but you in some shape or form reason around them. And so I decided at that point, at least the choice for me at that point was whether it's a science or an art. And
Mm.
I decided I needed to go the science side, mostly because I used to find the science subjects a bit more attractable and generally do better with them.
Mhm.
And I used to find the art subjects a little bit more difficult because at least at the time I thought they needed a bit more, they were a bit more memory based. And science was less so, not that it didn't require a memory function, but it did. So that was the first, you could say the first junction at which I had to make a decision.
Yeah.
Um, And then fast forward later on, having to make a decision to go into biochemistry, and that was also a major decision point at the university level. And then fast forward a couple of years, again the decision to then take that biochemistry into the bioinformatics pathway. And there's been so many decisions ever since, which maybe we shall cover as part of the podcast later on. But
Mm.
what you realize is that it's a series of decisions, and really it's something that keeps happening until the very end of one's career.
Yeah, for sure.
There's
Mm-hmm.
always choices to be made and different paths to be taken.
Yeah. And all
That's
the
it.
choices lead on to the next and to the next and to the next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly
Mm-hmm.
right.
Okay.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering, so I get where we're at the point where you picked a science stream in high school. And
Yes.
then I'm wondering why biochemistry specifically. Was it a conscious decision or was it one of those, it happened and we went along with life's flow of events?
Yes, very good question. And I have to admit it was a mix of the two.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I needed to do biology in some shape or form. But
Mm-hmm.
also, at least in Uganda, most of the people who do biology at HSC, the aim is to become medical doctors. And it's a bit different now, but it's largely still the same.
Mm.
There used to be, one of few channels that somebody was expected to take. But I knew that I was not so interested in being a pure physician or a pure doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so at the time, I thought that what I needed was to go more into the basic science. And I say So that is the informed part. The uninformed part that was by chance was that biochemistry was one of the few subjects that were offered as courses at
Mhm.
Makerere University. Um, and so I did it because it was what was available in terms of basic science. There were a few others. There was things like zoology, botany,
Yeah.
um, organic chemistry, which I thought were a little bit uh, uh, a bit separate and slightly different from where I wanted to go.
Mm.
Biochemistry seemed to be the closest to human basic science.
Mm.
And so I went down that pathway as a matter of what was available at the time.
Yeah.
And ended up doing that for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Major, as a major subject. And then I minored in chemistry.
Okay. Okay. So then you did biochemistry
All
and then
right.
minored in chemistry. And these are very hard sciences, I would call them. Like as you said, they're basic science subjects. So they're very hardcore science. So how was that transition? And first, what informed the transition and how was it to then do a master's in bioinformatics, which is more data intensive? And I'm guessing biochemistry and chemistry was not as data intensive, which you could tell us. So about the transition, what informed it and how it was.
Yes, and this again I think speaks also to your earlier question of
Mm-hmm.
decisions that you make at different time points.
Mm,
Because but also some level of serendipity and or chance, but also what is happening in the environment around you.
mm,
Because um, I am of the age where at least in Uganda, when I was at university, computing was really just beginning to become truly um, publicly available. I mean, of course, computers had existed. I remember in high school, I had done a course on computing, but a very basic course on, what are the components of a computer.
mm,
Uh, um, but truly, when computers started becoming a bit more publicly available was during the course of my undergraduate. And I remember that at the university, there were maybe 2 or 3 rooms that had computer labs, what they called computer labs, and they're the only places you could access any computer of any form at all. Um, and you'd go in there and play with them and try and do stuff with them. And so I think during the course of my undergraduate, I picked interest in computing. And so by the time I finished, I knew I really was interested in computing, but then I also didn't want to throw away my biochemistry. Like you said, it's a hardcore science, which is quite difficult. So I thought that, yeah, well, I think the win-win would be to find a sort of uh to mix the two, find something that works for both, that is can be both bio but also computing.
mm,
Um, and I think a few years before that, bioinformatics had just been started as an area or as a major, study area. I think the first courses in bioinformatics had run about maybe 3 or 4 years prior to that. So it was still very fresh anywhere in the world. Um, and I remember very clearly I was visiting, talking about the combination of chance and purpose as two separate but interconnected things.
mm,
I was visiting with a friend somewhere in the UK, and they had a catalog. In those days, universities advertised their courses through what they called catalogs.
mhm,
Those were like books where they publish their courses. These days everything is online, of course. And he had a catalog, and I saw opening through, looking on the bio part of the catalog, I saw there was something called bioinformatics. I was like, wow, that sounds good. What is that? Um, so I went in, read a bit about what it was, but in those days, it was not the bioinformatics that it is today. It was still a very young field. But regardless, the name caught my eye, and I decided that, well, I think because that was soon after I finished my undergraduate, and I was trying to figure out what next. Um,
Yeah.
and so that I was like, I think I should go into this thing and do a master's in bioinformatics.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. So you went in, did you know what it is about? Like after you realized that you knew about it, like you saw it in the catalog, did you have any idea before of what it is about? And how did that match up to when you actually started your master's?
Yes, sort of. I had a good idea, but
Mm.
of course, nobody ever prepares you for the real thing until you do it. But I
Yeah.
had an idea because the catalog sort of showed what you would call the course outline,
Mm-hmm.
what are the different things that are going to be taught. But of course, because it was a new area,
Mm.
there were several components of those, what you would call topics, which you would not really understand very well. Even
Yeah.
though it sounded like you understood them because it was a new course, they were really different. Or they were not exactly what you thought it was.
Mm.
Um, but I did some due diligence because I remember the summer before I started, the course would start in August or in September. I remember that time
Yeah.
I used to take hours off like every day, sit down for 2 days and start going through materials. Again, things were beginning to be available on the internet. So I knew the course would have something called PAL. That
Mm.
was before Python became a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very common now programming language in bioinformatics. But at the time, PAL was the programming language in bioinformatics.
Mm.
Um, and so I knew the course would involve a good chunk of computer programming, which is something I had never ever done. Because biochemistry
Mm.
as a great course was all definitely theory and lab practicals, but nothing to do with computer programming. So I knew
Yeah.
that if I was going to fare well in that course, I needed to get up to speed with programming. And I did invest quite a number of hours in trying to do power programming and getting familiar with things like HTML, which was then a major vehicle for web pages. And so I did quite a few tutorials in that, a little bit around databases, and also started reading around sequence alignment
Mm.
because I'd seen that in the course, and it was a totally new thing. I knew about um, nucleotides and amino acids, but the concept of doing sequence alignment was totally new. And so I started familiarizing myself with that. Regardless, when the course started, yes, it was a difficult one.
I can imagine the
Yes,
transition from wet lab to dry lab. And
yes.
then, so I'm just wondering, like in all this, you mentioned how you stumbled upon the course in a catalog and how you did so much background work because you knew that how difficult the transition would be. But you also mentioned that bioinformatics was a fairly new field at the time. So did you have anyone you knew before you who had been in the field that you could consult, or were you just going in blind?
Yeah, honestly, it wasn't exactly blind, but no, I didn't know anybody.
Mm.
When I made the choice of the course, I didn't know anybody who had done the course.
Mm.
Um, uh, in the university where I did it had just run for 2 or 3 years.
Mm.
Certainly nobody in Uganda, where I came from, had done the course, obviously. Um, I just knew I needed a course. It sounded good to me, but no, I didn't at the time have any people that I was following. It was just a pure, uh, which maybe you could say was,
Sorry about that. Yeah. Hmm.
that's okay, which maybe you could say was a little bit naive, but that's what it was. It was a new area, yes, and there were not many people
Yeah.
who so, and this
Yeah.
was true of Uganda, but it was also true of the West also, in the UK or in the US. It was still pretty a new course.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. I can just so I did for my undergraduate, I also did epidemiology and biostatistics. And at the time I did it in Kenya, it was new as an undergraduate course. So I
Yeah.
somehow relate to you want to do something because you want to do it, even though you don't know someone who has done it before. But
Right.
sometimes you can also be the person that people know. You can be that person who people know that did it before
Right.
that. And that's why we have such platforms where you share your journey and now people can know that these things work like that.
That's exactly
Now,
right.
once you started your master's, so tell us about I think your research in your master's, what you did, what it was about, and how, if it did help you transition now into the bioinformatics field. Yeah.
Yes. And that was a very interesting one because, of course, when you do the master's, where I did it, like it is in most places, it has a coursework component where you do a lot of the theory, but also still do some practicals. But then it has the research component where you're purely diving into research.
Mm.
And the way it was at the time was that you could either do it with a company. I remember
Mm-hmm.
going to interview with some company, whose name I will not say, in London, and I thought I'd interviewed very well, but I didn't get a call back. Or you could do it at a university. So there was something called the Worldwide Universities Network, WUN, at the time, which tried to connect young students across universities around the globe. And through it, I applied to do my research at the university called Penn State University. Um, Penn State University, it's a very nice campus in something they call Happy Valley,
Mm.
Pennsylvania. And yes, the professor said, "Oh yeah, sure, you can come and do it. The only thing is we don't have money to look after you and everything, but we don't have a fellowship, so to speak. But if you can find some resources, you can come and do it." And so I scrambled to get some resources, and I went and worked with them for 6 months. And yes, it's at that point that you started really, really applying your skills. At the time, I remember the main project, of course, as all labs go, they had several projects going on, but the main project that I worked on was actually building a database for the mouse genome.
Mm.
This was the time also, I think the mouse genome had just been sequenced like a year before. And there was efforts in the scientific community to try and, of course, research about it, but most especially at the time, what we're doing was to organize it,
Mm.
creating a database that is appropriate, identifying features in the mouse genome and seeing how you rationalize those between different components of a database so that they can speak to each other very well. But then to do that, it means you have to read around the biology to understand exactly what is in there, how
Mm.
it works. Um, and then you have to learn about, at the time, SQL was the major database technology. You had to learn a lot about SQL, the language, and then you have to pass things, how to pass information. Um, and actually, I learned a lot about programming in Perl, programming in SQL, about how to think about genomes and how they're organized. Of course, mouse is a mammalian
Mm.
genome, which is, uh, and so it was very good because one, you learned a lot of skills and you are applying them on a real use case. But then two, you also got exposure um, in meeting new friends in a very different country, different people, and for the first time working in a lab environment, what they call labs. That means scientific groups working together to solve a problem
Mm.
and beginning to realize how they're organized and how they do things. Um, and also attending, because then you're just doing research, you have a lot of time to attend workshops and seminars and conferences and getting used to scientific speak and scientific jargon and presenting ideas and articulating them. So it was a very useful and rewarding experience of 6 months. Yes.
Okay. So I'm just wanting then because you also went ahead to do a PhD in bioinformatics, but from
Yeah.
what you've mentioned, it sounds like you really got a very fulfilling experience. Like you got the theory and the practical bit of bioinformatics in your master's, and you
Right.
even got to do like a practical placement. So what is it that you felt was missing that you needed to do a PhD in bioinformatics as well? And how did that PhD help you grow in the bioinformatics field?
Yeah, very good question. So when I finished my master's, I was like, this is it. Because it was a very grueling process. I was like, this is it. I'll
Mm.
never go back to school again. Like, this is it. I'm going to do, you know. But when I look back, it looks like it was just fatigue.
Mm,
So I finished my master's and I came back to Uganda. And I was lucky to get a position here at Makerere University, a faculty position, but then also I was helping at another university um, uh, in Uganda also. So I sort of held two positions, which was possible at the time. And I was just happy teaching computing. So at
mm,
the time, there was not a whole lot of mathematics in Uganda. It was not there really.
mm,
You're talking about 2006, 2007. Um, there was barely anything classical bioinformatics. So in fact, when I came back, they didn't really know what to do with me. So, but when they looked at my CV, they were like, "Oh, you have computing there, so you should go to the college, the Department of Computing." So I ended up with a position in the Department of Computer Science because that part people could understand. The
mm,
mathematics, not really. Um, and so I taught pure computing, IT, computer science for 2 to 3 years because there was not much mathematics here. But
mm,
I still kept in touch with the people I'd been working with both in the UK and in the US as part of my master's. Um, and so after I think 2.5 years, the fatigue had gone. And I was like, and I could see that in the field and the career that I had chosen, it would be very useful to do a PhD because of the extra skills it gives you, um, and the extra competencies it gives you, especially into becoming an independent scientist.
yeah, for sure.
So after I'd done it for about 2 years, an opportunity became available in something called a Fulbright, which
Mm,
is a scholarship that the US Department of State runs for individuals from around the world. And so I applied for that, very competitive process. But a small anecdote to that is that while I was doing my research at Penn State, there was another Ugandan who was completing his PhD in a totally different field. But he was, of course, I can't say the name, but he was also a Fulbright scholar.
mm,
So fast forward 3 years later, I go to attend my Fulbright interview,
mm,
and guess who is part of the panel of three people? That was him. And luckily, we had gotten very well. We had lost touch, but
mm.
met in the room, and so I interviewed. So Fulbright scholarships, as you know, are very very competitive and very yes, they're super competitive. But
Yes.
I
Mm,
interviewed and I was lucky to get it,
mm,
and off I went to do the PhD. And another person again had met at Penn State, um, who is a professor from Poland, but who was based in the US at the time. I think these days he's based in Germany. He actually connected me to another professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Who I was like, oh, there's this kid I worked with him. I think he'll be good. And so when I had to choose universities, I ended up choosing that because I had a connection there and it speaks to the networking side of science and how it is important to do that outside of the pure science itself.
yes. Mhm,
Yeah.
for sure. So,
Right.
earlier you mentioned the way when you started in the field, the software that was being used was PAL, and then at some point you worked in database building using SQL, and now we have Python. So we have a question from one of our audience who's asking about strategies to pick up this programming skills, especially in this world where a new language comes up almost every time, but you have to keep up with those trends. So how would you advise someone, especially coming from a science background and then getting into computing and picking up this programming skills, strategies that worked for you?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very important question because
Mm.
while I did a PhD, I discovered that one of the things I regretted I hadn't done earlier was to pay attention to mathematics generally, but statistics in particular.
Mm.
Because programming languages are languages,
Mm.
but they have a strong mathematical logic. They're not mathematics itself, but they're very logical in the way that they function and in the way that they organize
Yeah.
and in the way that the code is processed by the operating system and how it is passed and translated into actions. It's a
Mm.
very logic-based thing, and it requires a decent amount of mathematical and statistical thinking. So the first answer is um, wherever you are, I think being a competent scientist, like please invest some effort in understanding math, but also most importantly, understanding statistics and statistical theory. You
Mm.
don't need to be an expert in statistics, but you have to understand the basic concepts, like the central tendency towards the mean distributions and standard deviations and what exactly they mean
Mm.
and tests of significance and that kind of thing. So that is one thing. When you do that, it makes your programming a lot easier, or you learning another program easier. The
Mm.
second answer is, of course, that when you know one language, and this is true for computing languages as it is even for human languages.
Yeah.
When you know one language, it makes it a bit easier for you to learn another one because the concepts overlap a whole lot.
Mm.
The actual grammar and syntax might change, but the concepts remain fundamentally the same across all programming languages.
Mhm.
So please learn one to start with. The second, which of course everybody would expect, is that practice, practice, practice. uh, However good you are, if time lapses or goes without sufficient practice, of course you start rusting away in terms of your competence.
Mm.
Um, but the fourth one is that I think for people who are learning bioinformatics or in bioinformatics in this day and age, they're much luckier because I think there's so many tools to help one learn and become proficient in a language. Um, Obviously, AI-based tools, large language model-based tools, but even just the sheer number of tutorials.
Mm.
Um, I wish I had done my bioinformatics at this time. It would be a little bit easier. Uh,
Mm.
so the take home is really to encourage people not to freak out. I mean, for people, especially of a lab background,
Mm.
wet lab background, sometimes they freak out, but honestly, it is not difficult. If you can do an
Yeah.
experiment to grow bacteria and assess
Mm.
and take measurements, you can definitely do programming. It shouldn't scare you at all. You just need to give it some
That's
time
very
to become
encouraging.
proficient at all. Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's very encouraging. And speaking of practice and tools, it's like you read George's mind. So we have one of our audience members called George who asked, how was your learning experience in bioinformatics and programming at that time, given that there are no many this YouTube tutorials, we have YouTube University now.
Yes.
So how was it for you without all these readily available tools?
That's a good question. So that was the time and the age where you needed a textbook. I know a lot of younger scientists, rarely touch a textbook at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yes, you needed a textbook.
Yeah.
you had to work your way through the different topics in the textbook.
Mm.
Um, and try things out, of course, on your computer as you work your way through the textbook. And moreover, those textbooks at the time, there were not many that were soft copies. They still were hard copies that you had to buy in a bookshop.
Mm.
Um, and, and and so, but the thing is, the human mind is such that if you don't know any better, you cope with what is there.
Mm-hmm.
We know that things become easier, and we thought that it's just the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So I can't say it was very easy, and I'm not a super efficient programmer, I have to admit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but with these things, mostly when you understand what you want to do, it's possible to whip up some code and check with people who know better, and they guide you along.
Yeah.
Of course, in later years, when you started having blogs where you could check and throw questions and people give you answers, things became a little bit easier.
Mm.
But yeah, to begin with, it was a textbook thing. You look at the thing in a textbook, you have to read and understand it as a hard copy textbook,
Mm.
and then try it out on the computer separately. They would give you some exercises at the end, which you now try in the computer. Um, but I think the positive side of that is that um, it really, really, really made you understand how the things work. Like there was no room for leaving things in a black box where you're like, I'll just use this tool.
Mm.
Really hard to understand, to know things from, as they say, from zero or from ground zero. And that
Mm.
helped a bit in the conceptualization.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
And then, so let me take us back to your journey. So we left you where you are now teaching in the Department of Computer Science. And we
Yeah.
have a question from Moffat, which I think will help us transition to the next bit. So he asked if there are any African-led bioinformatics initiatives or collaborations that you're excited about. And I feel like this is the right point to ask. How did you move from that point where you're teaching you have done a new program, you've come back, you're teaching computing, to being the director of the African Center of Excellence in Bioinformatics and Data Intensive Sciences? So, how did you bring all that knowledge into this wonderful institution, and tell us more about it as well?
Yeah, a combination of preparation, but also luck,
Mm.
really. Because unlike when I first did my master's, when nobody knew anything, or maybe some people knew, but when there was nobody implementing bioinformatics, at
Mm-hmm.
least in Uganda, um, when I came back for my PhD, and by the way, when I finished my PhD, I first worked for 2 years for the CDC in Atlanta. So this was
Oh.
many years later, maybe 5, 6 years later.
Mm-hmm.
The ground had shifted and people had started using bioinformatics.
Mm-hmm.
And so it had really drifted so much that at that time, everybody was acutely aware of the need for bioinformatics skills.
Mm.
So when I came back, luckily, um, people were thinking about this. And in fact, an organization called NIAID, some of you might be familiar with it, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, part of the NIH in the US,
Mm-hmm.
could see, as many others did, that these skills were needed. And so it was starting these centers of excellence. They had started one in Mali, in Bamako, and they were considering that they should start one somewhere in East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And again, talking about networking, I met somebody who was the head of NIH in Uganda. And he was like, we're just looking for somebody at a PhD level with these skills so that we can start. Now that you're here, let's start one in Uganda. And things started from there. So we eventually had, over a period of 2 years, several meetings, several presentations here and abroad, and several phone calls, several, mobilization of resources by our partners at NIAID, but also here at the IDI and in Makere. And the center started 6 years ago. The IDI gave us space, NIAID gave us equipment, and we were lucky to get an NIH grant to sponsor the first master's and PhD programs in bioinformatics in Uganda. And so we started them, and the thing came together very well because there was this infrastructure, high performance computing infrastructure, which was coming in through NIAD. There was a new course, the bioinformatics course, master's and PhD, that was starting. And so you had a new fresh injection of fresh blood, people who are bright young scientists wanting to plug in. And then you had the research environment where people really needed these skills. There was so much research going on in the infectious diseases, in the non-infectious diseases. And so the ecosystem started coming together that way. And that's how I ended up helping serve as the lead for the center.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a bit more about the center, what it does, how someone can get involved?
Right.
Yeah.
The center, like I said, is part of a network of other centers in other countries, mostly one in Bamako, Mali, but also here in Uganda. But then we also have our colleagues at something called BCCB at NIAD. So we do several things. The first, like I said, is we do training, especially at a graduate level, master's and PhD programs in bioinformatics and data science. The second is that we actually also apply those skills through actual research. So we do a lot of research in antimicrobial drug resistance specifically, but also in cancer genomics, human genomics, trying to understand the genomic landscape of cancers in Uganda and among Africans, and also trying to understand and find solutions for microbial drug resistance, which is becoming a big problem. And we also do support research outside of that sometimes because we have students who are interested in things other than that. And sometimes we help with supervision and that kind of thing. So that's one thing that we do. We do training. The other major thing that we do is we provide high performance computing platform for scientists. So for a lot of genome-based studies, and of course now in the age of artificial intelligence, there's so much research that you cannot do on a normal computer or even on a normal server, where you need huge amounts of compute resources. So through our NIAD partners, they've helped support the acquisition of these HPCs, and so we provide that to scientists who need it. They go through a quick application process and approved or not. And so this is almost like providing a lab. If you are talking about wet lab, it's like providing a laboratory where people can come and do their experiments. This is how it happens in the world, in this computing world. So we do provide HPC. We also do visualization because we realize it's a major component of the scientific research. And so we do virtual reality. We have colleagues who do that here, and other kinds of augmented realities. We are engaged because, of course, we have a computing strand. We're engaged in creating software for the bioecosystem here in Uganda. So, for example, we do the sickle cell registry. We build and maintain that for our colleagues in the Department of Pediatrics. We develop software apps that are used in the medical and health space. For example, we're working on one on epilepsy. And so we have a sort of software strand or a software component that we do. So if you're to summarize what we do, there are three major things: training, then we provide HPC, computing platforms for research, and then we also perform research ourselves. We do get individuals, we do run internships every summer. Individuals can apply. Of course, they're not unlimited for internships in any of those fields. It can be bioinformatics, it can be in data science, it can be in artificial intelligence, it can be in cancer research, it can be in antimicrobial drug resistance research, it can be in visualization, programming, and that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. Sounds very intensive. And so we have a question in the audience, and it's about bioinformatics as a career option for someone who's starting out in science,
Yeah.
given especially the exciting work you're talking about, even bringing in the new technologies such as AI in bioinformatics. What would you say are the prospects for someone starting out in bioinformatics as a career option?
Wow. I would say there are unlimited prospects.
Mm,
But I would qualify that with for somebody who is really dedicated to it
mm,
and is willing to invest the effort and the time and the hard work, the limitless effort. I mean, and of course I'm biased because it's the field I am in, but I think it's definitely one of the fields where there's so much that has to be done. There's so much that is unknown. There are so many things people could discover. There's, you know, and even the tools are becoming more and more powerful, of course, with AI, but also with these increasingly powerful compute platforms. And I think even objectively, it's true. I think I saw an article somewhere trying to rank or what they anticipate might be important skills for the next couple of decades. And
yeah.
this thing, which I would say is at the interface of computing and bioscience, those two things, I think is going to be around for quite a while because there's so much that needs to be uh,
Mm,
so in the areas of drug discovery, in the areas of cancer research, in the areas of any disease you can think about, but also in things that may not be entirely bioscience, because when you do mathematics, you become a proficient programmer. You can turn your skills to programming apps that are doing something different. You can, of course, teach if you want to. You can develop solutions of your own and sell them, either as software. And the thing is, you don't even have to choose any one of them because you can do a combination of them. So if you teach, for example, it doesn't mean that you can't develop your software and sell it,
mm,
or it doesn't mean that you cannot do exciting research in a new area.
mm,
And, and so the opportunities are really immense for somebody who is willing to really put in the time. Like I look at some of the individuals that we train, they immediately, you know, go find opportunities both here and abroad, because the skills are that needed.
mm,
So for somebody, but the important thing is to be interested. Like if you're interested in the science, especially, it shouldn't be something that is done as a financial solution, get money. But yes, the interest first. If you're really interested, you
mm.
much better and the opportunities are limitless.
Mm, yeah, the passion for sure. Mm, yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned earlier in your journey that you started out in your undergrad in Uganda and then you went and studied in both in the UK and in the US. You worked in the US for a bit and then you came back now home to establish this center and to build capacity on the continent. What strategies do you think can be put in place to bring back more people on the continent to advance research on the continent?
Good question. There's some one would say obvious answers, but I think sometimes I think they're very simplistic, which is if I was saying a simple answer, which is oversimplified, is to say, well, create a welcoming environment or pay people better. But I think those things are, they are, of course, those are obvious. Like one thing to attract talent is you have to compensate it well. Um, and also the environment has to be rewarding. But we all know that that is not always a reality here. Um, but for individuals who are interested, they can create their own opportunities.
Mm,
Uh, there are even dimensions or there are ways or there are certain contexts in which being here, say in Uganda or in Africa, can be advantageous because you have a slew of unique problems. You have unique populations. You have sometimes unique diseases, or if they're not unique, then they play out differently in the environments. And so um, for somebody who is keen and who is really interested, they can make their own way without necessarily being given a job, or at least not a straightforward job. And science is beautiful because if you're a good scientist, most of the time you might need somebody to give you a platform to start with. But once you have started, you can, because if you're good, you write your own grants, you get funded for them, and you do useful science, you can fly on your own. But there are also organizations that I know need these skills. Um, um, and that is one answer. The other is that because of what has happened, especially post-COVID, sometimes we may not even necessarily need those individuals to be here physically. I do have, of course, colleagues who are based in other countries, but do work with us here on a daily. They're either in other African countries or in places in Europe or in the US, and vice versa. I know some people who used to work in the US and now they are back here, but they're still working with their colleagues in the US on a daily. So I think the combination of the internet and post-COVID culture has meant that yes, these individuals, even if they're based elsewhere, they can still make huge contributions to the science here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So some members of our audience seem to think that when you when you spoke about the center and the work that you do, that the options are for Westerners. I would like for you to remind our audience that the center is actually based in Africa and the work is being done in Africa in collaboration with other people, of course. But yeah, could you speak more about um, bioinformatics career prospects for Africans, because it seems like all these things just don't sound like they're for us. So please speak about that.
Yes, and maybe part of it, of course, is the high sounding words like bioinformatics, artificial intelligence, which really sometimes sound so complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, they're not. I think because just in the same way, most people have phones now, smartphones, and they use them for all sorts of things. So you do have a branch of computing, for example, for finance, for auditing.
Mm-hmm.
Computing is used for communication, of course. Computing is used for reading. You can read your books there.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way, computing is also used in biomedical sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so it is as simple as that. The fact that you cannot do without your smartphone now also tells you that you can also not do without computing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine if you can't do without it for just making phone calls and chatting on WhatsApp. How about when you're doing research or when you're doing work that involves health and medicine? Definitely, they can contribute. Computers give you a great platform to use in those fields. So, absolutely, these things are not just for others, and there are aspects where they're even more applicable here than elsewhere. Of course, both in science, but like in Kenya, I know things like M-Pesa, and it's not science, but clearly
Yeah.
for those use cases, computing and or mobile telephone is much more useful, much more reward useful in Kenya than it could be maybe in the US. That is true also, even in biology. There are the diversity of African genomes, and like I said earlier, the way in which diseases play out in populations, it's unique, and they need local people who understand the local environment to work on them. So absolutely, these things are for us as they are for everybody else. But in fact, there are even use cases where they are more for us. They might be for other geographies or other
Yeah.
populations.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. And you also mentioned that the center the training aspect has master's and PhD programs. So Is that the application for search? Is that information that is available on the website that members of our audience can access if they are interested?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, it is. It is ces.ac.ug.
Yeah.
I think I can
Mm-hmm.
type it in the in the chat. That is
Okay. Yeah.
https://yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that
Okay.
information is available. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So, as let me see if there are any other questions. Okay. So, are there any particular challenges like that you're facing as a bioinformatician in Africa and how you go about them? So, challenges that are unique to bioinformatics in Africa.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're exclusively unique to Africa, but I think
Yeah.
I would say to most low and middle income countries,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, because they are both resource related. I think the major challenge is, of course, the ecosystem is not as rich, but by that I mean in terms of having people in all sorts of specializations. When I worked in other environments, you would
Mm-hmm.
have people specializing in so many different small things, but everybody is a super expert in it, and so that can be quite useful because the environment is rich. If you want to know something about something, you know where to go.
Yes.
But also because there's certain critical mass of individuals, it
Mm.
means that the ecosystem is self-refreshing because you have conferences you can attend, you have workshops you can attend, and so you're continuously getting renewed
Mm.
and continuously networking. But I think in low and middle income countries, I want to say just Africa, I think there is a level of quote unquote isolation,
Mm.
even with the internet and Zoom and that all those things being available. It
Mm.
is still can be useful when you're in an environment where there's a critical mass of people who are doing things close to what you're doing because you keep having conversations which help you think more and more about what you're doing and therefore improve it. You keep having tools, new tools. You find somebody found this, the other one is using the other one, and that can be helpful. So one issue is what I call isolation. Like the ecosystem is not as rich in terms of the human resource.
Mm.
Um, of course, the other obvious one is resource limitations. Obviously, our ecosystems are not as well endowed as you might find in high income countries.
Mm.
But sometimes that is also then gives you opportunities to innovate and to find solutions.
Mhm.
Um, so I think those are two major challenges.
Mm.
But there are also so many opportunities, like I mentioned,
Mm.
uh, based on the unique problems you have to solve and the unique populations. And it's becoming a bit easier to network. So we have things like DSI Africa, which are cross-continental and with collaborations in the US and in the UK and with other geographies.
Mm.
So it is true there are challenges, but those challenges are not fatal and not insurmountable.
Mm.
Mm.
Okay. I'm surprised that it's already been an hour. It felt
Yeah,
so short.
because of yes, it
It
really,
went
really
so fast. I think when the conversation is very engaging, but I think
mm.
what I would like to ask you as we finish, so we are my science journey, we're talking about science journeys. What do you hope that young African scientists can take away from your science journey as the last one?
And this is only because I have had the opportunity to be on this for actually over 20 years now.
Mm.
But every time I think back, I think the things that cannot be substituted are two things. One is the interest, and by that I don't mean just the interest, but being fired up about something,
Mm.
um, uh, finding something that you're really fired up about, and most of the time when that is the case, other things eventually fall in place.
Mm.
Um, the second, and it's true, it's not just for science, but it's for every field really, is that a little bit of patience. I think a lot of young
Mm,
scientists want things to happen now and or after 1 year or after 2 years.
mm,
But the truth is that in all fields, not just science, things do take time to build up
mm,
and to get to a good level.
mm,
Um, so patience compared with the right focus and the right um, interest
mm,
are really precious. But of course, the other thing that cannot be substituted is networking. I think in my own journey, that has been a running thread that keeps making things happen. Without it, even with the best science, the progress, one would not progress as much.
mm,
And it is something that is a daily skill that one has to teach themselves. How do you talk to people? How do you express what you want? How do you maintain networks? And how do you infiltrate networks?
mm.
And that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yes, the thing is to encourage
Mm,
being interested in what you're doing.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I would summarize it as the three P's. So purpose, patience, and people.
There you
And I
Wow.
was
Couldn't have put it better. Yes, three P's. Purpose, patience, and people. Exactly.
yeah. Thank you so, so much for your time today.
Thank you, Anita.
This was so lovely. I think the 1 hour went very quickly. And also thank you to our audience for the engaging questions that built the conversation as well. So I would request you to stay on the call a bit longer as I end the YouTube live, and then we can wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, sure thing.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for your engaging questions. And I will see you in the next MS.